This is Casey with CAK Tutorials. Today I'm going to be doing my third tutorial on JavaScript. In this tutorial I'm going to cover some more basics, including semicolons, white spaces, breakup in code, and I'm going to touch base on variables and the formatting of variables. I will be covering variables more in depth and getting into data types and other things in my next tutorial. I'm just going to start off with, again, just the formatting of the variables. So I don't have anything to discuss before we get started, so let's go ahead and jump right into our JavaScript. So here is my example.1 that we've been working with. And let's jump into semicolons. So what are the importance of semicolons? You might have noticed in my previous two tutorials, I'm ending each line with a semicolon. And this is important because you have to end each line in a semicolon. A lot of different programming languages are like this. In fact, some, it'll actually break the code if you don't have a semicolon at the end of each line. And let me save this. I just did two alerts. I did a hi and a bye, and a refresh, and there's hi and there's bye. So you can see if I go ahead and just put these all in the same line and I just run this continuously, it'll still function. But what happens if I remove that semicolon? It will, of course, break. So you have to put a semicolon at the end of each line. Now, some browsers are more forgiving. In fact, if you just forget the semicolons, it'll probably still work. That being said, don't forget the semicolons. It's really important. It could potentially cause problems. It is a standard and a best practice. So I do want to stress that even though if you forget one, it may still work, remember to always put a semicolon. Just get in that habit. It is very important. So moving on from semicolons, I wanted to talk about white space. So what's white space? White space is simply putting space in and around your lines of code. So if I save this, we'll see that it still works. Now I have a space here after alert and before and after my string and then before my semicolon. And once you get into longer scripts, if we were going to do a for loop, and I'll just go ahead and do real quick, again, this isn't something that you have to memorize. So this right here is a for loop. So as you can see, it's kind of jarbled in here, and if you want, you can actually space all of these out. A lot of people put spaces before and after any operators like equal and plus and so forth. But if you wanted to break these up just to make it easier to read for yourself, you can space things out a bit. Now you can't put spaces in commands, obviously. It can only be in between significant portions of the script. At the same time, you can't remove spaces that need to be there, like in between certain commands. And in this example here is right here. VAR is actually declaring this variable, but if I remove this space, that will break it. And that's the only thing I'm going to cover. In fact, in my tutorials, I will exclude all spaces that aren't necessary. I might show you as I'm going through different things like for loops and so forth where you can put your spaces. Just know that if you need it to be easier to read, you can add some white space in there just for your own viewing pleasure. The next thing I want to talk about is breakup in code. So a breakup in code is basically doing multi-lines with the same line of code. So if I save this alert, hello world, there we have our hello world pop-up. So if you're doing strings, and these strings are really, really long, you're putting a lot of information in here, what you can do is break it up with a backslash. So you do a backslash, and then you can actually bring your string down to the next line. And if I save this and refresh, you'll see hello world is still working. It's important to remember you can only do this within strings. So if I put a space after alert, again, working with my white space there, it'll still work. But what happens when I do a backslash and then bring this down to the next line? Then it breaks. You can only do it in between quotation marks. So if you have a string, which is anything in quotation marks, you can use a backslash and then bring down the rest of the string to the next line. So where this is going to be important is if you want to do a document write, which I covered in my previous tutorial, and I just want to write to the screen. Now, say I have a long string, or I want to do something like include another div. So I have my div, I'm going to give it an ID of element2 because element ID is already being used. And then I want to kind of structure this so it's a little bit easier to read. I can do, this is Casey, and then my div, and then I'll have to close out my document. Now at the end of each of these lines, I can include a backslash. Now if I save this and run this, we'll see this is Casey appears on the screen. It's all in one line, and it's within this div. So as you can see, this helped me break it up so that it's easier to read and I can structure things a little bit easier. But again, it's only within strings. You can't do this in code. But you can see here's my semicolons. That means that's where the actual end of this line of code, this statement is. Again, if you wanted to, you could remove all of these white spaces and all of the backspaces and run this all in the same line, and it'll function exactly the same. So that's the basics on breakup in code. Again, these things, both white spaces and breakup in code, are just to help you view the code easier so that it's easier to read and it's easier to work with. The last thing that I'm going to go over is variables. So what are variables? If you're familiar with any other programming language, you're going to know what a variable is. For those who don't know what variables are basically it's an object that can hold a value, and then you can use that value over and over, or you can manipulate that value. So let's give an example. The first thing that we need to do with each variable in JavaScript is do var. var declares a variable. It's important that you declare your variable before you use it. So let's do variable I. Now I can end this with a semicolon. I don't have to give it a value, but let's give it a value of 0, and then I do my alert, and let's just do alert I. And I save that and I refresh, and there's my alert 0. I can also do this in a string. Hi. So there's hi. So this is what a variable is. What I want to talk about specifically in this tutorial is the formatting of variables and how you actually can format variables. Again, in my next video I will discuss all the different data types and things you can do with them. What can you actually use as a variable? Well, the first thing is you obviously can't use any words that are reserved for a specific purpose, like alert or var or document. You can't use those as variables. So if you have a variable that you made, again, it's easiest to use variables that are very descriptive of what you're using them for. But if you have a variable and it isn't working, check to make sure that it isn't used somewhere else in JavaScript, that it's not reserved for any other purpose in JavaScript. The things that you can include, say if I wanted this to be name, and I'm going to give my name Casey. I can start it with any letter. I can also start it with a $sign. So if I do $name, there's Casey. If I do just name and just start it with a letter, it keeps working. The last thing that you can begin any variable with is an underscore. So the three things are any letter, an underscore, or a $sign. Those are the only three things you can start a variable with. Inside the variable name, you can also include numbers. So if I wanted name first, I can do an underscore in here. I can also, if I wanted to, for some reason, include a $sign. I could do that, and I could also do a number. So there we see we're still working. So all three letters, underscore, and $sign you can include at the beginning or within your string. You'll notice in some languages all strings have to start with a $sign, and that's a way that you can work with them. It's easy to actually see them. They stick out if you use a $sign. Other conventions usually are, I mean, you can use an underscore to separate things. You can do the same thing where you go name first, where the first word is lowercase. This formatting is usually for functions, but you can use them for strings too. Again, it doesn't really matter. It's what you want to work with. You can look at some of the standards of what people choose to use. There is kind of a set of rules that people use, and that's going to make it easier to view other code that other people have. The other thing I wanted to bring up is you can have a number within your variable, but you can't have it at the beginning. So why is that? Well, because if you're going to do something like, let's simplify this and do a equals 1. Then let's do another variable b, and that equals 1 as well. Now I actually want to perform an action on this. I want to add them. So I'm going to do a plus b. And I do save, and there's 2. And this is why you can't start it off with a number, because numbers are actual integers and used as such in the script. So if you start something off with 1a, it's going to get confused and think that you're trying to do a number right away, and then it might try to do a calculation. So that's the reason why you can't use numbers at the beginning. But within, if you have multiple values, if you have a 1 and variable a 2, you can use numbers within the variable name or ending the variable name, just not at the beginning. So that's the basics on variables. Before we get too in depth here, I'm going to cut myself off and save the rest of the discussion for my next video. In the next video, I will be discussing more on variables, including data types, null values, and undefined variables. Also, I will start on arrays and objects. I'll probably have to split that up and get more into an array and objects in other tutorials, but I will start touching base on that on my next video. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and comment, and I will see you next time.